Where was I when Marcha began? Well, I would like to answer this question by talking about, not just about me, where I was, but about where was the Methodist Church when Marcha began. I will also talk about where I was later on, but I want to say where was the United Methodist Church? Of course, I believe it's vital to see that Marcha did not come from the sky 50 years ago, and there it was. No, there were some things that developed before Marcha began or had its initiation. It came at a very opportune time, not just for United Methodists, but for the whole community of Hispanic Latino population. Since the 19th century, the Methodist Church has had ministries with Hispanic Latino in this country and Puerto Rico. Now, some of that developed in various places where there was concentrations of that population. It was done by the Methodist Episcopal Church and the Methodist Episcopal Church South, and also the United Brethren also did some work with Hispanics. That's what it's called. They were particularly in states like California, Arizona, Nevada, Florida, Colorado, Illinois, Kansas, New Jersey, Puerto Rico, and Texas. Now, if you're interested in knowing more about that, you all may want to consult Justo Gonzalez, wrote a book just on that issue, so how that Methodist Church came. In the mid-century, by this mid-century, the 20th century, the church had not developed much resources for the Latino ministries that there were in these isolated places. There were some Sunday school materials, and there were also some devotional materials. That's all there was. And the church developed two committees. The first one was the Spanish Resource Committee. Several general agencies got together to be able to coordinate the development of Spanish resources and curriculum resources. And then there was the Junta Consultiva de Comunicaciones, which was an advisory committee that was linked to the United Methodist Communications Commission. The General Board of Higher Education and Ministry began several courses of study schools in Spanish to help train local pastors for the United Methodist ministry. The 1950s and 1960s were very important years for our country, not only because that's when the significant growth of population, but also because it was a time of great social change, particularly due to the civil rights movement and the Chicano movement. And these two movements impacted our Hispanic Methodist leaders, okay, because they also got involved in that, and because our country, the leaders were interested in changing some of the situations, some of those concerns that arose from our own communities where we were all part of that time. And while the Methodist Church then had already begun some ministries all over the country, in Puerto Rico, there actually was not an overall coordinated plan of developing resources or strategies or anything, okay, with the ministries that attain to Hispano-Latino people. There was no strategic response. There were other groups, ecumenical groups, that also were meeting also. For example, there was a ecumenical women's group that met periodically around the country. There was another COHAM that was also a group of leaders from various denominations, Protestant denominations, that met together in different places. And it was precisely in one of those meetings that was happening right here in San Antonio that some Hispanic Methodist ministers and lay people that got together and met here and talked about the creation of Marcha. And it was, in fact, our bishop, who is now Bishop Joel Martinez, who was the one that came up with the name Marcha. He was the one in that particular meeting that developed that. The next year, this was in 1970. In 1971, for example, then the first convocation took place. Now, I had been a pastor here in San Antonio before the convocation, okay, and then I had moved to El Paso, and when the Coham met here, I was not here, but then I moved from El Paso, a church in El Paso, to Dallas to do my doctoral studies at SMU, and so I was, my wife and I were part of the participants that went to the first convocation in 1971 in El Paso. It was a very chaotic meeting because there were people from all over the country, from where the Hispanic ministry were taking place. California, Nevada, California Pacific, Kansas West, Puerto Rico, Florida, Colorado, New Jersey, New York, and Rio Grande. These were the conferences that were Northern Illinois that sent representatives to that first convocation. It was a large convocation, but people did not know each other. We had not ever gotten together, so there were a lot of tensions for a while, all right, but so people did not trust each other, all right, and so it was hard to develop a structure, but we did it. I mean, that was done at that first convocation. And so after that, it began to move. We got a director, and so of Marcha, and he became then part of the spokesperson, thanks to some grants that the Commissioner of Religion and Race gave to Marcha to continue meeting and helping staff Marcha. What has Marcha meant to me? To me, Marcha has meant a very important entity in the life of our church because it's brought together lay and clergy leaders, first regionally and then nationally. It has served to provide a network of support and for training of leaders, particularly those that were in isolated ministries. Sometimes there was one church or another ministry in one conference, another conference, and Marcha was able to bring together this group so they would feel a support, a network, a support group. Now, in Puerto Rico and in Rio Grande, which were conferences at that time, they didn't need that because they met together anyway, at least annually, and some of them more often because they met in districts. But beyond these two conferences, there was a need for that to happen, for networking. Some of those regional Marcha groups actually provided some programmatic training for leaders also. That was happening even though their chief and their principal duty was to provide advocacy for Hispanic Latino ministries and issues. When our denomination decided to make ethnic minority ministries its programmatic priority, that's what we call it, programmatic priority, then that became a very important place where Marcha was very influential because he participated in the development of that priority, the implementation of that priority also. Marcha was very much integral part of that, and since it was created, we as leaders were able to participate in those meetings and encounters and training events. But what happened, although it continued various quadrennia, this ethnic minority ministries, Marcha was able to learn and get the experience not only about learning how to work with each other, but also it became very important because it became, the leaders there became aware that we needed a strategic plan, because sometimes the agencies just did what they thought it was important, and the priority just set down some goals, and then it was up to the agencies to implement it. And we needed something more focused than that. And that's where the idea of a national plan was born. Okay. In fact, the idea of a national plan came because the strategy committee of Marcha, which I was chairing at that time, met in New York in 1987, okay, at the Roosevelt Hotel. Even I remember that, and there were different ideas thrown out, and then another group was formed that met in Nashville that had generated those ideas, and then Bishop Martinez and I were given the task of actually writing the proposal, okay, or the petition it's called, and we sent that to Marcha, and Marcha approved it, and then sent it to the 1988 conference. 1998 conference, and then approved it, and formed a study committee, okay, to research and develop a plan, okay, the National Hispanic Plan. That committee was chaired by Bishop Elias Galvan, okay, and I was also part of that committee as we worked along. In 1992, the plan was presented by Marcha, okay. It was really a plan that Marcha sent, okay, and it was approved almost unanimously. More than 92% of the delegates approved the plan in Marcha, of the national plan. Now, Marcha has continued to develop, or Marcha has continued to be part of the plan, because the committee, the National Committee on Hispanic Ministries and Latino Ministries has a steering committee, has a national committee, and Marcha has always been part of that. And so the influence of Marcha and its concerns has been reflected in that committee. Marcha has changed, but it's continued to develop leaders, particularly, for example, in the recent years, Marcha has focused on training young people for Marcha and for the church, leaders for Marcha and the church. Now, why am I a Marcha? Why am I in Marcha? I served in Marcha as an officer for 8 years, but I have been in Marcha more or less 20 years. 20 of those 50 years, I was active in Marcha. And so for me, it has meant a way of not just representing myself or my ministry that I'm attached with, because we have understood ourselves and that we're not isolated. That our ministry, what affects my ministry, also may affect other ministries elsewhere. What we've learned here needs to be shared with others. And those kinds of networks, those kinds of feedback have been very important, and Marcha has helped foment that, assisted that to happen. We are not isolated. We're all part of a whole, okay? We need to continue to advocate for Hispanic and Latino issues. And by the way, I talk about Hispanic, Latino issues because at one point, all we talked was about Hispanics, but it was in the plan that we had to decide whether to include Brazilian ministries or not, and we have included Brazilian ministries in the national plan, and so I was a director then of the plan, and so we incorporated Brazilian ministries, and that's why today we talk about Hispanic Latino ministries in the United Methodist Church. Okay. Unfortunately, the forces of racism, of resistance, of evil, I think, attack not only one place but other places all throughout, not only individuals but systemically. And so we continue to need a voice of advocacy, because it has been a voice of advocacy for issues that pertain to justice issues. It has been a place where it has addressed issues of the racism within our churches or within the church. It has continued to advocate, we need to continue to advocate for the reform of our immigration policies, particularly passing the DREAM Act. We need to continue to develop networks within our own Methodist Church, but also a network, because Marcha has also done this, a network with churches outside of the United States, in autonomous churches like in Mexico, in Argentina, in all of South America and Central America. And Marcha has been instrumental in fomenting and developing these kinds of networks with that. We need to continue that. Now, what do I wish for Marcha, for the future? Or how do I see the future of Marcha? I do not think Marcha is going to disappear very soon. The need for Marcha will continue, unfortunately, because racism, a myopic vision of ministry, the continued growth of Hispanic Latino ministry community in the United States is not diminishing at all. It continues on. I would hope, I could dream that someday we will not need Marcha. But I do not see myself, I'm a realistic man. I do not see that I will see that day where we will not need advocacy for justice and for the Hispanic Latino ministries and people. I hope that Marcha will continue to incorporate not just Latinos and Hispanics, but other peoples, okay, to our God-given cause, all right? Because the whole church needs it, okay? We do not just need it, the whole church needs it, and we need to incorporate non-Hispanics, non-Latinos also within Marcha. The church at various levels has yet to respond, it seems to me, accordingly. And Marcha will continue to struggle with, for example, financing it. But I believe that Marcha will continue to play a very important role of advocacy within our church. Thank you.